Well, if you really believe in the Jewish God, I think you'll accept Christ. He claimed to be the Jewish God, revealing himself as Messiah in human form. He's either a crackpot or he's the tree. So then the question is, what does the evidence point to? Does the evidence of his life, teachings, death, and resurrection point to Christ being a crackpot? If it does, reject him. But if the evidence of his life, teachings, death, and then resurrection from the dead points to his credibility, trustworthiness, reliability, be very wise to put your faith in it. But another issue, Ellie, that you've raised wonderfully is, I'm skeptical about God's existence because I can't hit proof. I'm skeptical about the reliability of Christ because I can't prove he rose from the dead. Okay, so my point is, but the evidence is God exists, and the evidence is that Jesus is relied. Now, the comeback to that is, but I'm still skeptical. I can't believe it because there's not enough evidence. Here's the embarrassing question. Okay, I'm giving you evidence that God exists, giving you evidence that Jesus is relied. You've said not enough. No problem, I understand. But the question is, what's the option that is supported by more evidence? And the answers, Ellie, that I get to that question from some of the most educated people in the Western world are embarrassing.
Then with Stuart,
that's already packed. If we're going to believe in Jesus, whether he's a teacher or whether he's on a dress, what was just unpacked there, because it was pretty big, and it's true. If we're going to address Jesus and we're going to believe in him as this historical figure, then we have to address whether what he claimed to be is true or whether he's just crazy, because we know that he claimed to be God. Now, whether he is God or he's just a nutcase claiming to be God, we have to come to one of those conclusions. And the world is quick to question whether Jesus is trustworthy or he is delusional. Now, this doubt often stems from a misunderstanding of the evidence available and skepticism around the supernatural. When we meet Jesus, it's like standing at a crossroad. We have to either acknowledge we're going to go at a fork in the road, and on one road, it's going to say Jesus is absolutely bonkers and crazy. And on the other side, it's got to be Jesus is really God. Jesus is who he said he was. And Jesus himself posed this question, and it's recorded in Matthew 16:15. And he asked, but who do you say that I am? And this is the ultimate question to each and every person. Who do you say Jesus is? Because in John 14:6, he says that he is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life. And he says that no one comes to the Father, he's talking about God, except through me. Now, in Christianity, Jesus' life, teaching, death, and resurrection provide the trail of evidence that can be examined and trusted. And ultimately, we believe his resurrection is the ultimate verification of his claims. But what we believe it on is not just blind faith. It's a commitment based on overwhelming proof. And we're going to go through that in this video.
and Cliffe and Knechtle. So you're Orthodox Christian pastors. You've got a local church. Yeah, is there anything else that really can add to your description? You post on YouTube. You've got a big audience.
Oh, we speak on the university campus.
Yeah. No, you've got a lot of clips that go viral there. I think the first question in this conversation, I want to talk about the big questions a lot of people have on Christianity or Judaism, or a lot of it. I think mainly Christianity, because I think you're the experts on Christianity. But a lot of it's on the Old Testament, which relies on different religions, of course. I think the first question would be, you both go around to these to a lot of audiences. When an atheist comes up and wants to ask you a question, or the main question a lot of them ask is, how could you convince me that Christianity is real? What's your response, or what would you tell them?
Well, the first question is there a God? Does God exist? And I think the evidence of the fact that the universe has a beginning, everything that has a beginning has a cause, the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has to have a cause, is pointing us to the most reasonable answer, which is, in the beginning God, not in the beginning hydrogen. Second piece of evidence for God's existence is moral absolutes. The moral relativist cannot live out moral relativism. Because the moral relativist regularly says you should not have done that. You ought not to do that. So it's impossible, practically speaking, to live out moral relativism, because we all embrace moral absolutes of some kind. Well, in order for there to be a moral absolute, there has to be an intelligent mind behind the universe. Because if there is no God, then it's human mind define right and wrong, and it's all relative. And if there are objective morals, there has got to be some type of intelligent mind along.
Yeah, let's address something coming up. And oftentimes skeptics and atheists, agnostics, will say that the universe came into existence from nothing. But I mean, even from a logical standpoint, nothing can ever be produced, right? Nothing is nothing. And I know that physicists will say that, well, we can't fathom it. You can't use logic to deduce that. You can't use logic to reason that. But I mean, logically, nothing doesn't come out of nothing. And imagine you're at a magic show and the magician pulls out a rabbit out of a hat. Now, imagine no magician, no hat, but somehow a rabbit still appears. It's going to happen because you need the magician, the act, and he needs the hat, he needs the rabbit to do it. And in the same, you can't have the universe, you can't have Earth, you can't have human beings, life, and everything that we can observably see and not have something cause that. Now, they'll say, well, then what created God? Well, nobody ever claims that somebody created God. In the Christian worldview, we believe that God is the uncaused cause, that God existed before time. Just like what it says in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this shows that God is the first cause and the sustainer of all causes. And this is affirmed in the New Testament. In Hebrews, it says in 11:3, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And in John 1:1, as Jesus is the Word of God, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, Jesus is the agent of creation. His existence reminds us that creation is not an accident, but it is purposeful, beautiful, and it points to him. And that your life is not an accident. It is purposeful, it is beautiful, and it points to Christ. Now I might jump ahead of Cliffe here for a second, but when you talk about moral relativism and moral absolutes, everybody claims to have moral absolutes, but not everybody understands that when you have moral relativism, you can't have absolutes. You can't have things like murder is wrong, or lying is wrong, or stealing is wrong. Because if you don't have a moral absolute, then those things become all subjective based off of someone's point of view. The moral relativists will say, well, what's right for you is right for you. What's right for me is right for me. But when we try living this way, everyone becomes their own judge, their own God, and anarchy, chaos. And it's like playing Monopoly, where everyone gets to make up their own rules. Well, I just start with $100,000 Monopoly. I start with all the hotels. I mean, is bound to flip the board over because everything is relative. Everything as we know it has rules, has boundaries. And God's moral law is absolute, as seen in the Ten Commandments. Even Psalms 19:7 says, the law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. Isaiah 5:20 says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And that's the world that we're living in today, where I can create my own definition of. Now, Jesus fulfills this law, and then he provides us with the moral compass we desperately need. That through his grace, he empowers us to live by God's unchanging standards. And when we're able to do that, and everybody's able to do that, then we can have some resemblance of peace. Because at least our starting point is the same. At least we're grounded on the same absolutes.
Giver behind the angels. Third piece of evidence for the existence of God is the only thing that comes from nothing is nothing. Nothing coming from nothing. And we obviously have quite a bit right here, right now. A lot of some things. And to think something comes from nothing is preposterous. It's illogical. Next piece of evidence that God exists would be love. I'm convinced that the most important thing in all of our lives is love, the relationships that we have. Well, if there is no God, love would be a biochemical reaction. And I'm convinced love is a free choice that we all make. That's my experience. That's my observation. And so therefore, based on our experience and our observation of life, I think it's more plausible, more reasonable to believe that God exists. Then the next question is, who is this God? What's this God like? And that's where different people claim to be revealing God accurately, but they contradict each other. So the question is, who is reliable? Who is supported by the evidence that they are reliable? And when it comes to Jesus Christ, the evidence is found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the obvious first question is, can I trust those Gospels to give me accurate historical information about Jesus? And the evidence of the manuscripts being so close to the events recorded, the number of manuscripts that we have, the literary style that's used by those manuscripts, historical narrative, not once upon a time in the land of Oz, wink and blink and all, that's fairy tale. The literary style is clearly the historical narrative. So that evidence points to the historicity of Jesus, that he really lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead. And obviously, if Jesus rose from the dead, the evidence is he's reliable. If you died and rose from the dead, I would listen to Richard. And so then the question is, all right, if the evidence is that Jesus is reliable, then what does it mean to responding? It is not blind intellectual naivete. Faith is evidence plus. So the evidence is Christ is reliable, and therefore faith in him is a commitment. So those are some of the lines of Gnostic.
So I think a lot of people, most people are agnostic nowadays. They believe in some sort of God, or that maybe not agnostic, but they believe in some sort of God. They're not sure what it is. They think there's some sort of higher power, but they're not exactly sure which one to subscribe to. Like you mentioned, you said there's different levels. There's a God, then which God, and you mentioned in terms of proof that Christianity mentioned about the New Testament. Does everyone agree that the New Testament is the absolute, is real? It's real history, or there's a lot of historians that say, that might not actually be real. Also, wasn't the New Testament written like 40, 50 years after all the events happened?
You're right. The New Testament was written 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years after.
To address what he said, is agnosticism increasing? Whether you're an agnostic atheist or agnostic theist. So an agnostic atheist, we kind of lean towards, I'm not sure, but I don't believe there is a God and there's no evidence for there being a God. And an agnostic theist is more, well, I believe in high power, I believe in deity, but the existence or the nature of this deity is unknowable because everybody's going to say something about them. The Hindus will say something about them, the Buddhists will say something about them, Muslims will say something, and will say something about them. And there's a growing number of people who identify as spiritual, so to speak, but not necessarily religious. They want to seek a personal spiritual experience without adhering to any kind of strict religion or belonging to a church or a particular. And this is true. Studies and surveys show that there is an increasing trend of people identifying as religiously unaffiliated, which include agnostics and those who consider themselves nothing. I believe in nothing. And so the younger generation and people generally with higher levels of education, bachelor's, master's, will move towards a more agnostic perspective, valuing personal spirituality and just defining who God is and what God is and ethical living or traditional religious dogma. And that's primarily because of the school system and how the school system has tended towards that kind of liberalism.
But there was a strong literary style that is used. It's historical. There's a strong oral tradition the Jewish people had of passing stories along very accurately. And obviously the gospel writers also used notes. So the overwhelming evidence is that although there are mistakes, manuscript variants in the New Testament, there's an incredibly high degree of certainty that we really have what they wrote. Now, obviously there are religious people and some religious scholars who say, no, it's totally inaccurate. The Jesus Seminar would be an example of that group. But I think when you study the issue yourself, you'll find out that no, the evidence is the Gospels are historically reliable. And you can get an accurate historical picture of Jesus when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
How many people wrote the Gospels?
4 people: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So 4 people, is that overwhelming evidence that it's real? Could 4 people have faked it?
It's catered for historians to say if there are 2 eyewitness testimonies of an ancient historical event, that's paper. They'll take that as almost 100% that it did happen. So 4 is actually 20 as much, but they reject it because of the supernatural side of things. If it was no supernatural, Jenkins himself, and then every single historian, ancient historian would say everything in the gospel.
That makes sense, doesn't it? Because if it's supernatural, if it's completely different, then you'd want more evidence to back it up. So is there any more evidence except for the Gospels, or is that like the main evidence?
If you take away the gospels completely, just based on the biblical sources.
Okay, let's just talk about quickly the supernatural, because actually there's still a lot of people who don't believe in the supernatural. And I'd like to kind of challenge that for a moment, because the supernatural is something that I wouldn't say you can definitively improve, but there is evidence for it. So for example, when you look at infrared sound and when you look at paranormal experiences, some studies suggest that exposure to infrared sounds like low frequency sound waves or light waves can cause feelings of unease, etc. And of course, we'll say that, okay, these have been mistaken as supernatural, but we know now that they actually affect the brain waves. They can activate certain things in the brain as well. When you talk about certain frequencies, we wouldn't know that these frequencies actually do that. Now, I've experienced people being healed from cancers, being healed from diseases that the doctor would say are chronic or that would never be healed. And people actually experience healing from this after people have prayed for them. In fact, we have a friend of ours at our church, and he was diagnosed with some type of neurocancer in the brain. And I think it's neuroendocrine cancer. And we prayed for him about a week later. The whole church came together and we laid hands on him, because that's what the Bible tells us to do. Gather the elders, lay hands with oil, and pray for healing. And we did. Now, God is sovereign. He will heal or not. But just last week, the doctors came around again with another set of tests. And this time they found no cancers. How do you explain that? Now, some people will say, well, this is not paranormal. This isn't supernatural healing. This is just some type of discrepancy, or maybe they misdiagnosed it. No, they diagnosed it. They have the polyps to confirm this guy had cancer. But then after he was prayed for, a couple of weeks later, they checked again, no cancer. He didn't do anything. He didn't do any treatment, didn't do anything. How did that happen? Now, I want to talk about also near-death experiences, because research has studied near-death experiences where individuals have reported experiences such as seeing bright lights or seeing things happen in different rooms and having experiences where they confirm what is happening in reality, but literally their brain is dead, their heart is not beating. And so how can we explain that other than something supernatural is happening, a level of consciousness that we have that we're just not aware of? And that's what the Global Consciousness Project is. It's investigating the possibility of a global consciousness affecting random number of generators placed around the world. And some correlations between large-scale events like, for example, 9/11 and deviations in the data have been observed. And although somewhat controversial, we're seeing evidence that this physical natural world is not all that there is. But still, when you talk about near-death experiences and you talk about remote viewing outside of the brain even functioning at that moment, they're clinically dead, but they're able to remote view somehow things that are happening in real life. And then when they come back to life, it's confirmed. That is the biggest evidence that we have that we are beyond this natural world. Our soul is beyond this body.
You could have the entire narrative still intact, based off of coins, based off of Josephus, based off of Tacitus, based off of ancient secular historians that were Roman, Jewish. So get rid of the Bible totally, and you still have thousands of Christians before any word of the Bible was written. And you have narrative pieced together from, again, names, coins, geography, ancient historians who were writing back then, Nero, who was persecuting Christians, all this written down. So you don't even need the Bible to get the story.
Oh, okay, because all that proof doesn't seem to go around. I've never seen any of those proofs. Like you mentioned, like coins. What's that? Like, is that coins from
Caesar? You have so many, especially the geography. If you go to Israel right now, and
go next week, yeah.
The majority of tour guides will actually use Acts, the book of Acts, to get around Palestine more so than any other map. I've never seen it myself, but many people have told me this who've gone over, and those were non-Christians. And they'll always be scratching their heads like, we thought the Bible was simply Aesop's fables or fairy tales or written as fiction, but it's written as non-fiction. So you have to say it's wrong and somebody was lying.
I think this is the main argument between, some atheists claiming that, oh, you're just worshiping this sky daddy, or it's the Bible's equivalent to fairy tales or Greek gods or whatever mythologies out there. The difference between Greek gods and the Bible is that the Greek gods are it's mythology. The Bible and the New Testament and the story of Jesus is not mythology. It's history. It's historical. And when you talk about the reliability of Scripture, critics will often claim that the Gospels are unreliable. There's only 4, but actually in history, just like what Stuart said, you need 2 to confirm that it's real. So we believe Homer. You need 2. We believe in Aristotle. We needed 2. We believe in Alexander the Great. We believe in Genghis Khan. We believe in Napoleon. Actually, the life of Jesus has more evidence than all of those. So for someone to say that it's fabricated, well, if the Gospels were fake, it would be like trying to write a biography of Abraham Lincoln and claiming he fought aliens. But people alive during his time would know that it's false, and they would witness to that. And so the people who live with Jesus witnessed to that. And we have to remember that they were living in an oral tradition at the time. So they weren't necessarily writing everything down, but oral tradition was being passed down. We know that that was being passed down with a high level of accuracy, not to mention the 5,200 manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, which is bar none the most of ancient antiquity. The Bible is God-breathed and useful for teaching. That's what Paul tells Timothy. And its manuscripts and historical accuracy stand up to the most rigorous of a historical and archaeological scrutiny. 2 Peter 1:21 says, "For prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets through humans spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." The Holy Spirit guided the Word of God. Jesus is the cornerstone of that Holy Spirit, and the Gospels are not just historical records, but they're a divine revelation of who God is, a revelation from God to you. And trusting Scriptures leads us to know Him, to trust Him.
You can't say we can blink an odd, not an Oz, because it's not written that way, but it's written as nonfiction instead. That's what they're talking about. Like, for example, you look at the Gnostic Gospels as well. You'll see names that are not connected to the first century Palestine or Jerusalem or Nazareth at all. But if you look at the Gospels themselves, Simon, Mary, Martha, all of those names are the top names of the time period. And so that's what I mean by like geography names. But especially when I say the narrative arc, it's those writers like Josephus, Tacitus, like even the Talmud talks about how Jesus existed, for example, and who he was, a miracle worker. I mean, it's really interesting. There's no other religion that you can do that with. Every other religion, you need the Upanishads, you need the Quran in order to know the exact story.
Because I think almost everyone agrees that Jesus was real, but they agreed that they disagree on whether he was the Messiah and the Son of God, and what happened. Did he do the miracles? And that, I think that's where the disagreements start, if I'm right. You also mentioned about morality. Morality is absolute, and I'm sure you get questioned on that part a lot. Do you see what happened in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Is everything you see there, is that the absolute morality, and is that teaching us how to live?
No. Which of the Old Testament's historical narrative?
Before Cliffe gets onto this, I want to talk about really what Stuart was saying here when he was talking about there's no other religion that can do that. And this is true. When you look at historical documentation, there's no other religion aside from Christianity that has the most historical documents defending its faith, including, obviously the New Testament, right? Particularly the Gospels, is considered by many historical scholars to be the most well-documented historical text in human history. And there are numerous manuscripts and fragments of those manuscripts, some dating back to obviously early century AD. And those manuscripts provide relatively consistent accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ as we know it today. And there's no other religion also that has the amount of archaeological evidence that Christianity has, that various archaeological discoveries have been cited as supporting the historical context of the Bible. So for example, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls provided manuscripts that predated the New Testament and aligned with the Old Testament text, supporting really continuity and the preservation of biblical writings and biblical church. And then you talk about eyewitness accounts, actual eyewitness accounts by individuals who claim to have been eyewitnesses to the events that they describe. The Gospels, obviously, as they said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are first closely related testimonies of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And when you talk about historical impact, there's no way that the rapid spread of Christianity in the first few centuries was possible despite significant persecution. This is evidence of its compelling message and transformative power and experience from the early followers and disciples of Jesus Christ. I mean, the establishment of the early church and its growth is seen as really a testament of the historical reality of Jesus and his teachings. And you can't deny Christianity from that, although many people will try these days. And the last thing I want to say is, out of any other worldview or religion out there, the philosophical and theological coherence of the New Testament, the Old Testament, from the Old Testament and all the prophecies leading up to Jesus, the consistency philosophically and theologically of Christian doctrine, including concepts of the Trinity, the Incarnation, the resurrection, really provide the most rational and compelling framework for understanding the world that we live in, the nature of God, and the nature of human existence.
And it records how King David committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband to cover it up. When the Bible records that, it's not saying go out and do likewise. Rather, it's a historical narrative recording adultery and murder to cover up the adulteress there. So that's why understanding literary style is so important. The didactic teaching of the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 is not historical narrative. It's didactic teaching. I am the Lord your God. You'll have no other gods before me. Do not make an idol. Do not abuse my name. Honor the Sabbath. Honor your mother and father. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal, lie, or covet. Right, that's didactic moral teaching. But then there's a lot of history. 1st and 2nd Samuel, Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah in the Old Testament that gives historical narrative of how the Jewish people lived their lives, at times doing that which was good, and at times doing that which was evil. You read how God judges the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites through the Jewish people. Oh, that's ethnocentric. Aryans. No. It's God judging certain people by using the Jewish people. And then just to show that he's not into ethnic superiority of the Jewish people are judged by God through first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians for doing the same kind of evil that the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites had done. So that's a lot of history there, but it's not all history. There's also prophecy. Great Hebrew prophets ranted or railed against the immorality of the Jewish people. So when you read and some of the other atheists who poured scorn on a lot of religion, they are using the same type of thinking that many of the Hebrew prophets used in critiquing the Jewish people. And that kind of objectivity, that kind of consistency, I find to be very appealing.
So do you see Christian, because I know a lot of people look at...
I'll just comment quickly on Cliffe and what he's talking about, didactic teaching here. When you talk about didactic moral teaching, it's really a method of instruction that aims to teach moral lessons. If you want to teach ethical values, for example, you're going to use storytelling, or you're going to use direct instruction. And really it's designed to impart a clear moral message or lesson to whoever is reading it, the audience, etc. And this type of teaching is really we find it in literature, obviously, in religious texts, in parables and fables. And the reason why is because it creates a clear moral message. The stories allow us to be able to relate to those things. It has an educational purpose. It can instruction, and also when we were able to research the cultural and religious context of it, you can derive the true meaning from that. And what Cliffe is saying is that the Gospels and the New Testament, yes, in a sense, they're didactic, but they're also historical, right? The 10 Commandments is didactic, but the New Testament is also a historical document. And this is what I think a lot of people fail to see, is that they don't realize these are historical documents that we're dealing with, but also there's a message in it. It's a message of grace. It's a message that God came from heaven to earth. It's Christmas time almost. And this is the message. This is the message to you and I. This is a message that has continued to grow throughout time. Now it's being challenged, and is being challenged as some type of fable, but it's not that. It's historical. If you would search it and do your due diligence, you'll discover how much truth is packed into the Gospels and how transformative it can be in your life, in your relationships with your relationship with yourself and others. And really, most of all, in my opinion, the truest alignment with your fulfillment, your meaning, your purpose in this life, and true joy, not just joy outside of conflict or when good things come, but joy despite of conflict.
The Old Testament and see it as some people see it as a story, and you just pick out what works for you, and then not what works for you, but you pick out lessons. Some people don't even look at it; they look at it as made up. But I think most Orthodox Christians, Jewish people, look at the Old Testament and say, we can pick out more than pick out the story, but it's a real life story, and you can pick out out of 613 if you're Jewish, or different if you're Christian, but pick out exactly rules to live your life by. Is that what you look at it as?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to watch that disagreeing that you articulated very well, Andy, which is some of us read the Bible deciding what we can accept about God and what we can't accept about God. Others of us read the Bible asking, what can God accept about me and what does God find unacceptable in me? And I think it's far wiser to read the Bible the second way, because if I'm going to just pick and choose, I'm creating God in my own image. I'm creating a God that looks just like me. In fact, I'm playing God.
So what do you think about a lot of people that go into this?
I don't want to go into that because this is what really is much more prevalent in our societies today, that we create like a designer God, so to speak, right? By picking the aspects of Christianity, picking the aspects of the Bible that we want. And then we throw out the rest. Okay, well, pick and choose what I like, and I'll throw out the rest. And really, this leads to a God made in their own image. This is violating the commandment of God. Actually, this is original sin. This is Adam wanting to be like God, Eve wanting to be like God, not to follow God, not to follow truth, but to define my own truth, to define my own God, and to be God. That is the first temptation, my friends. And it's like assembling a fast food meal. Choose what's tasty and discard the veggies, discard the onions if you don't like onions. And the difference is faith is not a buffet. Faith is a full course meal prepared by God, and he knows everything in there that is good for you. Society wants to take from you. God wants to give to you. And Romans 9:20 reminds us, shall what is formed say to the one who is formed, why did you make me like this? God is sovereign. We are not. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Why is that? Because oftentimes our own understanding will lead us to a path of destruction. And Jesus calls us to submit fully to him. Why? Because following him, it means accepting all who he is, not just parts that suit us. And ultimately, it's for his glory and for our good.
Probably people that come into your church and that say, I keep to Christianity, but I keep to this, like, I like the spiritual side of it. I don't actually do anything religious, if that makes sense. I like having a spiritual deity. I like connecting to someone and to give me a motivation to do things in terms of, I don't actually believe everything that Christianity does, but I believe in the idea of it. What do you think of those sort of ideas?
I would ask them, are you sure you're worshiping God, or are you worshiping instead a picture of yourself? An unrealistic, glorified picture of yourself according to your own likes in Islam. I mean, it happens all the time around the world. People create God in their own image, and then they bow down before their own image. And what Jesus Christ and the Hebrew prophets are saying is, no, God is real. Now learn to get in touch with the real God, not the God of your prejudice.
The only moral absolutely we see in our culture, it's probably similar in the UK as well, is don't ever step on my freedom. The number one thing.
I think that much more in America.
Yeah, Declaration of Independence, right? Fathers who would weep and are rolling over their graves in the definition of what they think is freedom.
So we didn't have guns in the UK, so
those people who belong into our church are thinking that way. They're thinking higher power, like you said, in the Oprah Winfrey type spirituality. And a lot of people get the definition of spiritual but not religious completely wrong. They think that means, people are turning away religion, which is the religion they grew up with. And now they're becoming even more atheistic and think spirituality is something like just talking about the existential issues. See, people think spiritual but not religious, but they're saying spiritual, those are spiritual, actually more so atheists. But spirituality we can redefine. And so those of us, you're getting to a question, are walking into the church, with this type of, I would consider it baggage from their early years because they don't like how they were raised. What that spiritual and not religious simply means is those who are religious are going to church. Those who are spiritual are still in some kind of way worshiping God. They don't realize it, or they do realize it, but they just don't want any type of structure and attend church on a Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. That's exactly what I was about to bring up. I said, like, the spiritual side, a lot of it's by yourself and you're connecting to something higher power than you, and you might do it through meditation or different ways, and whether it connects back to the Christian God, Jesus, or whether it connects back to whatever God that you say you're serving. But then I think religious is more about the community aspect, but a lot of people get...
This is a good point, what I'm saying here. You know, a lot of people want to be spiritualists, but not religious. That's what we're tending towards, right? People rejecting the kind of structured religion and still seeking this vague connection, this vague relationship with God. And actually, that's rooted in Christianity. That's rooted in a relationship with God that Christianity teaches, but people just want to base it off of their own preference. And it's like wandering around really with a broken GPS. It feels like you're going somewhere, but you'll never really find your destination without a reliable guide. It's like going GPS, I will decide where the destination is, and I will decide how to get there, and I will decide whether that's the right route or not. And the reason why we rely on GPS is so that we don't have to make that decision. Now, it's not that God doesn't want us to make decisions. It's that he wants us to make decisions that are good for us. But he still gives us the free will and human agency to decide on those things. You see, Jesus says in John 4:24, God is spirit and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and in that true worship connects us to the real God, not to one we create through our imagination or picking and choosing. And Romans 1:25 says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the creator. And this is where the world is tending to. We want to worship the created thing, not the creator. And Jesus breaks through this kind of self-centered spirituality because he shows us he is the real God. And his spirit is able to transform us into true worshipers of God who are worshiping truth. And the greatest blessing in life is to actually align ourselves with. So when you take a freedom and you take happiness and you make those your gods, because they can be gods as well, right? Then we lose track that God is the one that wants to give us freedom and gives us freedom. And God is the one that wants us to experience happiness. Now, for some people, that doesn't make any sense because, oh, well, I'm fighting for freedom. But you can fight for freedom and still find yourself in the dark, still find yourself in incredible pain. But you can find God and you can experience freedom because God says that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And modern culture really twists freedom to mean doing whatever you want to do, right? But this often leads to emptiness and regret. We all know people who chased hedonism and just doing what they want to do, just seeking pleasure out. And we know how that ends at the end of the day, that we shouldn't seek pleasure. We should seek a responsibility. We should seek the God who created us to experience pleasure because he designed it in a way that would be a blessing to us and not a curse. Imagine a fish deciding, hey, I don't want to go from the water. And then it flops out of the shores, only to realize that freedom leads to death. That true freedom is actually found in Christ. And Galatians 5:1 declares, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. You see, Christ came into this world to set us free, to give us freedom so that we could experience freedom. John 8:36 says, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Jesus redefines freedom as living with God's loving boundaries. We know that we all need boundaries. As a good father, I will set boundaries for my child. And true joy and fulfillment come not from self-indulgence, but from obedience to God. You see, our world is full of confusion, relativism, skepticism, but Jesus steps into the mess and offers clarity, truth, and purpose. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, my grace is sufficient, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And when we surrender to Christ, he transforms our doubts into faith, our skepticism into assurance, and our pain into eternal hope. So let him turn your life's trials into triumph for his glory.